Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Seems to work. Not too bad. How are you?
I'm fine. Okay, let me see what's up with my camera. I'm like way too close. I don't understand. We have to edit all of this out. Yeah. So I don't know why my camera is so close.
Wait a second. I just need to use the screen light.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, bist du bereit?
Okay.
Okay. So I think we can start. Welcome everyone who joined us this morning or this afternoon in Europe for our little webinar about the Digital Markets Act. Please welcome with me Dr. Matthias Bauer. He's a German economist and director at the European Center for International Political Economy, ECIPE. He works on European and global trade policy with a focus on digital technology policymaking. Welcome, Matthias. And I'm so glad you took the time this morning to speak to us, not only about your new paper, but also in general about harmful regulation that is coming from the European Union. So let me start with the most basic questions for those people who did not follow the European developments in detail. What is the Digital Markets Act and what is it trying to accomplish?
Yeah. Good afternoon, first of all, or good morning to our friends and stakeholders in the US. Thanks for the introduction, Andreas. I'm always happy to speak to the audience of ADR. Yes, you're right. We are doing a lot of stuff on digital policy making, and we recently published a paper on the proposed back then Digital Markets Act. It's still kind of a proposal, even though the lawmakers in the EU are close to the finishing line. So what is the DMA? I think we should start with a few basics. The DMA, in short, it includes a large number of behavioral measures, behavioral rules for predominantly large digital companies that many in the EU call gatekeeper companies, gatekeepers in digital markets, as they used to say. And during the lawmaking process, the European Commission and previously its consultants, mainly a handful of competition policy academics, they established the notion that such gatekeepers have the ability to connect many business users and many end users through their services, and thereby they can create an entrenched market dominant position. Take Amazon, for example, the Amazon Marketplace, but you can also think of Facebook's advertisement business. And the Commission argues that size, or in economics lingo, how we used to say strong network effects, would allow these companies to leverage their advantages primarily through access to huge amounts of data, which allow them to expand from one area of activity to another, and thereby they undermine, or at least they have the potential to undermine, competition and contestability of markets by smaller companies or generally large companies that are not gatekeepers. So this is the reasoning of the Commission. Now, gatekeepers in the DMA, they are defined largely by two criteria. They must be very, very large companies, and they must provide so-called core platform services. So in terms of size, for example, we are talking about an average annual turnover in the EU of 7.5 billion. The threshold has been increased recently. We're also talking about a market capitalization of at least 75 billion euro, and the companies they must have or to be designated a gatekeeper, the Commission must found that they have a significant impact on the internal market. They are an important gateway for businesses to reach end users, for example, or they are in an entrenched position of dominance. And as concerns core platform services, basically the second big theme and set of rules in the DMA. The DMA targets all sorts of digital services, ranging from traditional online intermediation services to messaging services to virtual assistants, which have recently been included, but also cloud computing services. And also in terms of obligations, the DMA would, if it would come into force, either prohibit or hinder companies, for example, to process, combine data, or to cross-use personal data across their services portfolio. And there are other obligations, for example, obligations to allow businesses to sell end-user business, for example, on Amazon Marketplace, to sell their stuff on other platforms, third-party platforms, or on their direct online sales channels. Then there are provisions saying that gatekeepers shall not use unpublished data to compete with business users in the product and services market that business users operate, or gatekeepers shall allow end users to easily uninstall pre-installed application on mobile devices operating system, for example, which would, for example, hit Apple because it allows users to deinstall the Safari web browser, for example. So there are many obligations in the DMA proposal. Many are relatively vague, others are more precise and, let's say, more easily to be implemented on the side of companies. And all of these obligations have different implications for businesses, how they structure their services offers, how they innovate, and of course also boiling down to business growth and profitability.
Thank you, Matthias, for explaining that to us. So you wrote a very interesting paper, the EU Digital Markets Act, assessing the quality of regulation. So what did you assess? Please tell us some of the things that you found that are positive in the proposal, and then also some of the negative things that you were concerned about.
Well, there is not that much in the proposal that I would consider positive. So generally, what we did was less of an economic impact assessment. There are some out there, including studies from leading consultancies. They all conclude that the DMA has negative implications for innovation, businesses' costs in the European market. The European Commission's own impact assessment is relatively thin. It neglects impacts on economic dynamism, innovation, technological modernization in the EU, but more focuses on businesses' compliance costs. But anyway, what we do is more of a comparative legal analysis. So we did a comparison of the back then, I think it was in November 2021, there was a different proposal circulating in process compared to the one that what we see now, or what we recently saw agreed by the European Parliament and the European and the Council of the European Union. And we compared it with either implemented legislation in this area in Germany or proposed legislation in the UK and the United States. And comparing all of these legal initiatives, we conclude that the DMA could indeed be an opportunity to prevent and remedy anti-competitive conduct in digital markets. But it should serve more as a guideline for antitrust enforcement in the EU and globally. But the DMA is not a guideline. The DMA is a prescriptive regulation that tells companies what not to do, and it tells it often in a very vague and unspecified way without actually having evidence of anti-competitive conduct, anti-competitive behavior, and also without knowledge about the actual effects on different dimensions of contestability. So the problem is that policymakers only have a very rudimentary understanding of how specific digital services actually work and how they impact on innovation and how they impact on downstream value chains, predominantly the business users of these services. And we should also bear in mind where the inspiration for the DMA originally came from. It is inspired by antitrust enforcement in the EU and individual EU member states, such as the famous Google Shopping case on the ranking of search results, but also a case from the early 2000s against Microsoft and the integration of the Internet Explorer in their operating system. And there are more cases. Some of them are still ongoing. And for some of them, there is no finding of anti-competitive behavior of the particular company concerned. So nevertheless, the Commission took some lessons from antitrust cases of the past, of which many are ongoing, and then it tried to formulate business use cases for which it assumes an abuse, or at least potential abuse, of a market-dominant position. It argues, for example, that some gatekeepers exercise control over the whole platform ecosystem in the digital economy and are structurally extremely difficult to challenge or contest by existing or new market operators. Well, that seems fair enough. It seems like a very good ambition, actually. But at the same time, the Commission also wants to address all sorts of market failures without saying what a market failure actually is. But instead, it refers to two big themes, bold notions in the DMA. One is fairness and one is contestability. So the overarching objective of the DMA, as stated in the DMA, as frequently expressed by observers of this sometimes heated debate, the overarching objectives, they are fairness and contestability. At the same time, innovation and consumer protection seem to enjoy a much lower priority. To give you an example, fairness is referred to 88 times in the DMA proposal. Contestability is mentioned 60 times, innovation and consumers 16 times each. And none of these terms is clearly defined once. So there are sometimes conflicting conceptual notions. And of course, they result in conflicting objectives. And many observers have actually raised concerns about the DMA's general direction of travel, or drawn attention to specific parts of the regulations that are either ambiguous, so you don't really know what you as a company should do, or it's impractical because, for example, a remodeling of the business process undermines the features of the service, like user experience or safety of the service. Or they could lead to unintended economic harm in Europe if a company would have to take down an entire service from the European market, for example. And a particular concern is that very few gatekeepers have a clear understanding of what the DMA specifically asks from them So what should they do, and what should they do instead compared to what they currently do? And in our paper, looking at the DMA proposal and our regulations from Germany, the UK, and proposed laws in the US, we conclude that the DMA, like others as well, that it takes a novel approach, an untested approach to regulation. It is novel in concepts, in regulatory requirement, and taken together, it can lead to outcomes that later have to be corrected because of so many unintended consequences that no one can foresee these days. Fortunately, we argue the EU is not alone in experimenting with new regulations that specifically target the market power of large digital platforms. So there is actually a great scope for policymakers to learn from similar frameworks outside Europe, but also inside Europe, Germany, the UK, for example. And in our study, we compared several parts of these laws and proposals, and we used good regulatory standards or standards for good regulatory design as our benchmark. And if you want to read more about standards of good regulatory design, I can recommend you a large body of OECD and related literature on good regulatory design. So it's mainly about three things. It's about clarity of the policy objective. So why do we want to have a policy? It's about clarity of compliance requirements. So what the targets, in our case, the gatekeeper companies should do. But it's also about what we call proportionality and adaptability. So, for example, about the availability for the targets of the regulation to have regulatory dialogue with enforcement bodies, but also to have judicial review, like appeal mechanisms. And basically, we conclude, and I'm presenting this just in a nutshell, that the DMA's objectives, they should be narrowed, and clarity should, for example, be provided on how the regulatory objectives actually relate to concepts of traditional competition law, like contestability, but also competition in general. We also argue that the designation criteria for gatekeepers, they should be clarified and extended by additional qualitative parameters that are in line or coherent with the risk of harm. So Germany is a good example. You have a few quantitative criteria in terms of revenue, for example, but there are also other criteria that need to be taken into consideration by competition authorities to make an assessment of actual market dominance. And then we are a bit critical when it comes to the list of obligations that are set out in articles. I think it's 5, 6, and also 8. We are rather calling for a functional definition of regulated core platform services that would be closer to the real problems in specific markets. So taking into consideration, for example, a significant degree of dependence of business users from platforms, lock-in effects, but also vertical integration, very high barriers to entry, or serious imbalances in bargaining power to the detriment, for example, detriment of prices, quality, choice, and innovation. And then we also outline that obligations should generally be clarified, and more guidance should be given to companies on how they could comply with the DMA. So we do not actually say we need to get rid of the DMA. We take let's say, a more pragmatic approach, basically counting for the fact that it is very unlikely that policymakers will abandon the proposal. I think these charters, they cannot be undone, and which is why we tried at least to shape it for the better. Unfortunately, after several rounds of back and forth between the Commission and mainly the European Parliament and the Council, I think it actually it got worse. So the list of obligation extended, the list of core platform services extended, but the level of precision it it didn't really improve.
Thank you. I honestly cannot remember any proposal that went back and forth between the Parliament and the Commission and the Council that got better through this process.
Right.
So you mentioned something very interesting. Bless you. You mentioned that fairness was written down 88 times in the proposal. And that really reminds me of the digital services tax and some of the other proposals that we've seen in the last couple of years that came from Europe. And a big emphasis was always put on fairness. And I think the reason they use that word and they like this definition is because you can't really, it doesn't really mean anything. Fairness means different things for different people. And it's just kind of like it makes people feel good if you can tell your citizens in your different countries that the European Commission and the Parliament are fighting for more fairness in the marketplace. And so it's like relatable for many, many people. And this proposal in particular has been hailed as a huge step forward for Europe in making things more fair. But it also is viewed as a way forward for the European Union to be more innovative and to have their own gatekeepers, so to say, and have their own digital economy, digital industry. And they've been I feel like jealous for quite some time now that no matter what they're trying to achieve, they don't get this outcome. They're never as competitive in this industry than other parts of the world. So my question for you is, do you think this will be a good step forward for European digitalization and the European innovation and digital economy? And also, maybe you could point out one or two examples where consumer choice will be impacted. So, if this proposal would be implemented, things would change dramatically also for the users, and things on apps or services that they currently use would look very different, and they would look very differently from people, let's say in the United States, that use the exact same service and they can continue to use it, but in Europe, for the reason of the DMA, an app or a service would look very, very differently. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, you're right. The fairness issue. Fairness always lies in the eye of the beholder, as we used to say here in Germany, and that's obviously true in other parts of the world as well. But we saw this argument looming also for other digital package policies, including the Digital Services Act, where the Commission and its leading figureheads like Thierry Predor favored to run the fairness narrative, rather to really focus on the data about effective taxation of companies, which actually showed that many European companies, including large car makers and many large companies from France across industries, they obviously do not pay their fair share of tax. But that observation aside, does it, or would the DMA foster innovation in the EU, as is also claimed in the DMA proposal? I think the short answer is no. There are several studies out there that very early in the debate looked into the innovation impacts of the DMA, and they concluded innovation will likely go down in the EU. And there are several mechanisms at play. A key question for large digital businesses actually is, and that refers to the second part of your question on how to structure certain services, or how to kind of make apps waterproof for compliance with the DMA regulation. So the key question is, for companies, what can we do as a company to comply with the regulation to avoid massive sanctions in terms of billions of dollars, respectively? And due to the novelties of the DMA, and there are many untested concepts and very vague requirements often, the law will in fact increase legal uncertainty for businesses. Businesses that want to maintain operations in the EU, like a sophisticated Google Maps experience, or an Uber app that extends its services offers to food delivery, and all sorts of other stuff. that you can imagine that are currently being tested in the US. All these companies, and we are talking about the most innovative companies in the world, both for new technologies and also both for new technologies and also in terms of new business models. They will decide to innovate somewhere else first before they enter the EU market with adapted technology or adapted services offers. And I think it is naive to assume that there will be many European companies that will fill these gaps, given the language, the cultural, and the legal fragmentation of Europe, which in some prevents European companies from scaling or to become what European commissions often praise, actually, to become an international or global hyperscaler. And this will probably further increase the EU's digital or technology gap vis-a-vis other countries, especially the US, or other countries that still embrace economic freedom and that more rely on evidence-based antitrust enforcement. But there are some winners too, actually, I guess, and this is legal advisory companies. The DMA once imposed, it will be a huge stimulus program for legal advisory companies. It was actually intended to reduce the number of legal lawsuits in the antitrust domain, but most legal experts, and this includes advisors, but also lawyers within companies that I talked to, they predict a significant rise in cases brought forward by large companies against the European Commission's decisions. And the decisions here ranging from gatekeeper designation to enforcement obligations. So in some, higher legal uncertainty, more lawsuits, and less or lacking innovation in the EU, that will be the most pronounced, perhaps unintended consequences of the DMA in the EU.
Thank you. So in the last couple of years, we've seen digital services tax proposals. We have seen the Digital Services Act. Now we see the Digital Markets Act. We are now seeing the European Data Act. We've seen in the last couple of years many different cases of antitrust investigations and then large fines towards American companies. All these measures combined, also with local measures that some European member states put in place aside from the European Union, these are all viewed as very discriminatory, unfair practices, specifically targeted towards American tech companies. And my question for you is, now that we're so far along in the OECD process, and we're talking about details in Pillar 1 and 2, and the US under President Biden has basically made huge sacrifices, especially in Pillar 2 with the global minimum tax, but also in Pillar 1 with the reallocation of taxation rights, at a disadvantage for the US taxpayers, actually. Where is this going to stop? My question is, if President Biden and his administration keeps conceding and making more sacrifices to finally put an end to some of these unilateral measures, we might be ending digital services taxes. But in my opinion, if you just give it a different name and you collect fines through antitrust investigations, or fines because you violate some parts of the DMA, and you collect a significant amount of revenue also from those companies, that's still a very targeted process. You work a lot of your time on transatlantic issues. So what is your opinion on the impact on the transatlantic relationship if this moves forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. Now, looking at the disputes that we have and had for a long time now between the EU and the US, there's no great hope for being, let's say, optimistic. I mean, since the 60s, there were frequent disputes over subsidies in manufacturing, in agriculture, aircraft. Since let's say the early 2000s, technology markets and technology companies, they were treated with hostility almost on the side of the EU because of this huge success story of the US digital ecosystem, primarily a handful or a few more large digital companies. And I think these hostilities, they will not go away very soon. If you look at the DMA proposal, for example, and here I'm looking in, I'm quoting numbers from the Peterson Institute. The Peterson Institute, it identified 24 large digital companies that have sufficiently high market capitalization values and a high number of end users, so they could fall under the DMA gatekeeper definition, but only 11 would be labeled gatekeepers, considering other criteria such as entrenched market position or important gateway for business users to reach end users. And of these 11 companies, 10 are US American, just one is European, and the one European is SAP, even though there are some discussions in the EU on whether SAP actually qualifies as a gatekeeper. So, I mean, that's it's pretty clear what is happening here. From my point of view, the DMA is by design discriminatory, and therefore US lawmakers could and perhaps should challenge it. A remedy, in theory, for EU-US cooperation towards the better would be an alignment in both parties' approaches on competition policy. That would be a first start. With the EU, for example, looking more at consumer benefits, the EU committing to focus more on clear evidence of harm, while the US could do more on safeguarding data privacy. I'm also saying this because there are many voices in favor of a centralized federal privacy regulation. In the US, perhaps DPR light. We don't know. When you look at what's happening at the Trade and Technology Council, some of these issues are being discussed, but the big question is whether they will be addressed. And so far, we haven't seen much in terms of output, material output, that goes beyond, information sharing about joint regulation or about regulation or new regulations in the digital sphere, about standardization priorities, platform governance. I mean, that's at least something, but the direction of digital policymaking in the EU, it will not be reverted at any time soon. And I feel that even though we have the TTC now, we have geopolitical issues with China and even the military escalation with Russia in Ukraine, it will not be sufficient to make particularly European lawmakers to reconsider their regulatory attitudes.
I'm glad you mentioned the war in Ukraine and also China. That brings me to my next question. If we look at the recent developments in Ukraine, there's a lot of American tech companies, especially like Tesla, Google, Facebook, that use their platforms and services to help Ukraine during this war. Tesla, for example, provided Starlink services so people would have internet in times where there were massive outages, and then they could use Facebook, for example, to connect and find out, how their families are doing, if some of them made it out or not. And so I feel like this conflict is, it shows also how much good, big tech can do in moments like this. And I really wonder if this, is another measure that is really targeted and discriminatory against American tech companies. Will it not just open the door for China? Because there's no growth from European digital companies that would fill a gap if if services are not offered anymore, or services are changed in a dramatic way because of this proposal. Who could step in? And then the last question you could touch on, in your opinion, shouldn't we work together as the West, basically Europe and the US, to foster our own innovation, to combine our economies, to have more free trade, to allow more innovation to grow, to then effectively compete with China? I feel like none of, the US cannot win it alone. Europe certainly cannot win it alone. I think if we combine both of our markets, we are in a much, much better position. And I really fear that these petty fights that we have over tariffs that Trump proposed in response, for example, that I also really think is not a good idea. We need to move more into the direction of free trade, but then also the protectionism that we're seeing from Europe with proposals like the DMA or the DSD, where they target specific American companies.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are many voices now popping up in my mind. How to reply? So I think, first of all, filling the gap. I think, well, the likelihood that there are, Chinese companies trying to fill the gap in digital services market in the EU, I wouldn't oversell it. After all, there are these revenue thresholds, the market cap thresholds. So companies like Alibaba, Tencent, probably they will be treated like other mainly foreign large digital companies. But at the same time, there will be companies, including US companies, that will restructure their business models and try to circumvent the regulations of the DMA in a way that they can still kind of maintain control over their business lines, but comply with the regulation. So from that point of view, there is the risk that other companies, including companies from China, also enter the market and serve European clients. I doubt that they offer a better, let's say, quality user experience profile over the long term compared to European companies or to US companies. After all, we never know who's behind these companies in China, who is effectively exerting control over these companies. We do not know much about direct and indirect subsidization. So to speak European lingo, it's probably not in the interest of Europeans, which believe in so-called European values such as human rights and democracy in general. At the same time, I feel that the US administration should be more concerned about what is going on in the EU in terms of digital policy making compared to what is going on in China, because for many like-minded countries, and here I'm mainly thinking about the larger group of OECD countries, the Chinese model is not really attractive. At the same time, the EU model is more attractive, to put it that way, and the EU has the soft diplomacy power to increase acceptance of EU digital policy making in other parts of the world, particularly in the Western or Northwestern Hemisphere, as happened with GDPR. Even though GDPR is mainly copy-pasted by countries that have a strong investment and trade relationship with Europe, and there are so many countries, the majority of countries in the world, that have not implemented a GDPR-like regulation, nor do they consider one. But what I want to say is I would be more worried about EU policy making, digital policy making, because the standard setting power in like-minded countries, it is much higher for the EU than it is for China digital regulation. And ideally, the EU and the US should work more together on these issues. I can think of equivalence of rules. I can think of a greater efforts towards full harmonization of laws. But we do not live in an ideal world. And I doubt that the discussion in the TTC, and I mentioned this before, but also the geopolitical struggles with China and Russia, will change regulatory attitudes and regulatory ring fencing on the side of the EU. But my advice for the EU, it would be to look more inward when it comes to single market policies. And I think this should also be stressed by US economic diplomacy. What do I mean by this is I'm not advocating to look inward and push concepts like strategic autonomy or European strategic sovereignty or stuff like this. I'm more talking about the functioning of the internal market. And the DMA, if you read the first lines of the DMA, it's supposed to improve the functioning of the internal market, but it will not, it doesn't have the capacity to improve commerce across borders within the EU. The entire digital single market strategy and the recent digital policy packages, including the Data Act, the DST, the Data Governance Act to some extent, they will not simplify cross-border commerce in the EU. All these initiatives, they drive away attention and political capital away from the real regulatory challenges in the EU that in their effect really strangulate commerce and economic opportunity in the EU. Now, differences in language, they are a key barrier to cross-border business in the EU. You can't do much about this, what I would call cultural heritage, but you can, as an EU policymaker, focus on many other files, such as liberalizing and harmonizing policies in education services, healthcare services, public services, but also tax policy. And these are sectors of the economy and policy areas in which the government has a massive footprint. And I wonder why we still have a very heated debate about large digital companies which compete on the basis of merit, whose business model relies on voluntary transaction, voluntary interaction, and we do not have a debate about the massive footprint of the government in these heavily regulated markets, where we as the consumers have to buy these services, education, healthcare, on the basis of law rather than voluntary decisions.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think the focus should absolutely be on mandatory services, where the government says you have to buy health insurance, you have to use this education system, for example. Are you concerned that some of the proposals that the European Union is putting forward, finds U.S. politicians, and they like these ideas and they want to implement them in the U.S. as well? I mean, we've seen the reports of recent meetings with Margaret Vestager and the new head of the FTC, Lina Khan, and there seems to be the same. I think they share the same sentiment of being anti-tech, and it's especially surprising to see that from a U.S. agency that should ideally defend their own companies and its own economy, but rather they agree with some of the ideas that Europe has put forward. And so I'm worried that some of these ideas will also be implemented as domestic policy here in the US. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yes, you're right. I haven't followed the debate since the beginning of the year, so I can only talk about what I saw in the past. When we looked into the US proposals, we were looking to, I think, 4 distinct proposals for platform regulation in general. Some are more kind of horizontal, covering more services than others. I think there was one proposal that was exclusively dealing with technical details for interoperability of services and the technical standards for interfaces, and all of these proposals, they have the same spirit, to put it that way, as the DMA, and we highlighted that there are pros and cons, of course. So we argue basically, okay, that's a bad proposal, that one's bad, but it's the lesser evil. For example, the one on interoperability. Interoperability, it's very specific. It is targeted. It tends to be more consistent with the policy objectives. And after all, we are talking about, in a way, standardization, offering guidance, And this is exactly what we miss in the DMA, not only in the provision for interoperability, but also when it comes to other provisions. So there are many bad proposals that were tabled and circulated, written in very vague lingo, and I think they would worsen at least not improve the regulatory landscape. They would inject more legal uncertainty for those who tend to be very successful, competitive, and competing on the basis of merit, rather on the basis of political rent seeking.
Yeah. Matthias, we will finish right on time. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. Thank you so much for answering my questions. For the viewers that are interested, you can find Matthias's papers on ECIPE.org, and then click on Matthias Bauer, and you will find all of his latest publications to download, and also as a short summary. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you again soon. Maybe we talk about another development that will come up from the European Union. I feel like there are not enough proposals. There will be way more this year and next year. So thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. We will never run out of business. And allow me a final line. We've just launched a new research project on the proposed EU Data Act, which is a very tough, complex regulation. It will result, depending on its implementation, in many unintended consequences, I would say. And the beauty with this regulation is that it's not only about digital companies, it's about the entire economy. So it's about data, not only in the technology sector, but also data in agriculture, and particularly in the manufacturing sector. So there's much more at stake, and I hereby invite our viewers, listeners to get in touch with me in case you are interested in supporting us with data, industry use cases, or also funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. This is a good opportunity for another webinar on the European Data Act coming up shortly. Wonderful. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
See you soon. Thank you. Bye.